So, one of the things that you mentioned in your article was sort of this idea that you can't look at milk in isolation. What did you mean by that? Or can you just describe what you meant by that? So, for example, how did milk get in butter? How did butter get a bad nutritional rap? Where did that come from? Okay, too much saturated fat or something in butter. I don't remember. Where did the science come from?
Well, I can tell you some interesting stories about butter.
Hello, and welcome to this special episode of Dairy Digressions, the podcast of the American Dairy Science Association, the Journal of Dairy Science, and JDS Communications. I'm Matt Lucy, former editor-in-chief of the Journal of Dairy Science and former editor-in-chief of JDS Communications and fellow of the American Dairy Science Association. I will be your host. Dairy Digressions is where we had to get an inside look into the science and scientists that are making headlines both inside and outside the dairy industry. We expose the cutting edge research that creates knowledge and drives innovation in the production and processing of milk for human consumption. Today, we are talking about a special issue in the Journal of Dairy Science entitled Dairy Foods, a Matrix for Human Health and Precision Nutrition. We have two guests, the first of which is Dr. Grace Lewis from the Department of Animal and Food Science at the University of Wisconsin River Falls. For those of you that do not know, the University of Wisconsin River Falls is part of the Universities of Wisconsin. The Universities of Wisconsin comprise 13 unique universities with a shared mission. Their mission is to help prepare students to be productive, creative, ethical, engaged citizens and leaders with an informed global perspective. Grace is an assistant professor in food science. She got her BS from Penn State University and her PhD also from Penn State University in food science and dairy chemistry. And she is an expert in dairy processing to enhance dairy protein and milk fat functionality. I know Grace because she's a section editor for the Journal of Dairy Science and very active at her in the American Dairy Science Association. Our second guest is David Everett. He's in the Ridditt Institute in Palmerston North, New Zealand. The Ridditt Institute is a premier national center for fundamental and strategic scientific research in food. Its area of expertise is an intersection of food material science, novel food processing, gastrointestinal biology, and human nutrition. The Ridditt Institute appears to be supported by a variety of major research institutions in New Zealand, including AgResearch, Massey, University of Auckland, University of Otago, and the Plant and Food Research Organization. Dr. Everett's current research activities are centered upon colloid and surface chemistry reactions in food that produce flavor and texture, and the mechanism of how food structure impacts upon digestibility and nutritional delivery. Dr. Everett has led dairy industry research projects while working in Australia, United States, Canada, Ireland, and New Zealand. He's a native of Australia, has his PhD in food chemistry from the University of Wisconsin, and importantly to this discussion, he is president-elect of the American Dairy Science Association and principal investigator at the Ridditt Institution. So welcome to my two guests. Grace, are you with me? Can you hear me?
I am with you. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Very
Well,
happy to be here.
what in the world? You're sitting around in Wisconsin and you're just enjoying the snowfall, or maybe, and you decide you want to head up this special issue.
Yeah, it hit me as I was drinking a glass of milk at our dairy farm, and it's just surrounded by the dairy, and you want to get involved and do something cool. So I had a great idea. No, it's actually, I always tell my students, milk is so much more interesting than you would ever imagine. It's, this white liquid, but why is it white? You have these proteins floating around that are large enough to scatter light, and it's just way more complicated and way cooler than any of my students. I hope by the end of my class they realize it's cool and I don't just bore them, but I think it is worth investigating the entire matrix that is milk and how it is perfect for precision nutrition and human health.
I thought it was kind of interesting, and we'll get to David's article in a second. But I thought it was sort of interesting, when David is our second guest, he's kind of talking about this understanding of how this unique food sort of evolved in a manner so it would be benefit the infant, which is very, very interesting. That you have this sort of this very unique, it is very unique. And I think that's what's so interesting about the dairy matrix. And we're going to kind of talk about that a little bit more today. You bring up, Grace, that in your introductory piece here, that 88% of the US population does not consume the recommended amount of dairy foods. Is that really true, or is that just something you found on the web? Like, it's that bad that 88% of Americans don't get enough dairy food?
Yeah, so it was Google AI. No, it's I had a reference in there. It's true, and it's also concerning how many Americans do not consume enough calcium. And milk is an excellent source of calcium, and it's something where I think we need to do a better job getting the message out about just how good milk is for you. And we've seen some increase in milk consumption, and things like cottage cheese are also growing in consumption. But I think we need to do a better job getting the message out there.
What is the deal with cottage cheese? I mean, why? Why more cottage cheese? I mean, that's like an old folks food. My mother used to eat that. Okay. So what is the deal with cottage cheese?
Yeah, so I think milk, well, I know milk is a complete protein, meaning the building blocks of proteins are called amino acids, and milk has all amino acids, all essential amino acids, making it a complete protein. And it's also highly digestible. So when you're looking at digestibility scores, you're looking at basically a perfect score for milk proteins. So it's highly digestible, it's a complete protein, so it's an excellent protein source. And then you get something like cottage cheese, which is high in protein, and folks who are trying to increase their consumption of protein, as well as people like athletes, they're big into cottage cheese right now. And I've seen a lot of people who are blending it to make it a smoother consistency for folks who are concerned about, I guess, the texture of cottage cheese. I'm a big fan, so I'm not complaining. But yeah.
I like it on pizza. Have you ever tried it on pizza?
No, I think that's wild. I've heard
It's
of
just
ricotta
like,
on pizza, cottage cheese, really?
what you do is you get the pizza and you don't cook it with cottage cheese on the top. You just get your slice of pizza and you put cottage cheese on top and you fold it and you eat it with cottage cheese. It's the best. Growing up, I grew up in central New York, okay? My mother, I keep talking about my mother. I love my mother. It's wonderful, deceased now. But, when she made lasagna, you didn't put mozzarella in lasagna. You made it with cottage cheese, which I thought was interesting as well.
Are you
So there
sure you're
are,
not talking about ricotta?
no, it was cottage cheese. Okay, it
All right,
works in everything.
all
Okay,
right.
so
Heard it
you
here
just
first.
you just go there. So you Wisconsin native, Grace, or what?
I am not. I'm actually from central Pennsylvania, and the most common question I'm asked is if I grew up on a dairy farm, and I did not. I grew up raising chickens, but I went to Penn State for food science and started undergraduate research in the dairy space and just totally fell in love with it and just continued from there.
Why did you become a faculty member?
Because I really enjoy research was the initial thought, and I do really enjoy research, but it's cool to explore your own avenues. But what I actually determined is that I really love mentoring undergraduate students. Like, I'm very passionate about it. I'm apparently pretty good at it, I think. My students are awesome and they've gone off to do awesome things. Even I've just been here for 3 years now. So originally it was for research, and then I decided I also really like teaching and mentorship as well.
How
Yeah,
did
what
you
do
get
you do?
involved with becoming a section editor for the Journal of Dairy Science? You said you're 3 years into your career.
Yeah, so I am very young. I got my PhD very young, and I always say, people are like, wow, you must be brilliant. I think everything just went really smoothly, and I really enjoyed what I was doing, so I was gritty and dedicated to the research. But I have to give a shout out to my advisors, Dr. Federico Hart and Dr. John Kuplin at Penn State, because they really gave me all of the opportunities you can imagine. They sent me to conferences, and Dr. Hart got me involved in being on the editorial board for the Journal of Dairy Science very early on. So apparently reviewers get rated, and my review score was pretty good, and then that went on to being on the editorial board, and then selected as section editor thanks to, I believe, Scott Rankin put my name in there for that. So it's just been me given opportunities, taking advantage of those opportunities, and moving along.
I'm not sure how I became a section editor for the Journal of Dairy Science, but I remember when they asked me if I'd like to be editor in chief, and I thought to myself, first of all, you think, who me? Who me? But I knew if I turned it up, they might never ask again. So I didn't want to turn it down. And it was one of the most, and I think you probably agree with this. It's very, once you start really getting involved in your scientific society and really, you got to invest time in it to get a lot out of it. You get a ton out of it, a ton out of this thing, and it helps you grow and it helps you sort of become a better faculty member or scientist and teacher, and before I talk to Dave a little bit, because I just want to ask you a question, because we haven't even talked about the dairy matrix yet, but we're going to talk about it. Okay, Grace, we're going to talk about it. I promise. But I want to ask you about this paper you wrote for JDS Communication, engaging today's undergraduate students in the field of dairy science with a focus on the female student population. Why did you write that paper? Where did that come from? Or just tell us a little bit about that paper and your thoughts on that paper.
Yeah, so I was giving shout outs to my former advisors giving me these opportunities. And again, they gave me all of these opportunities, but the entire dairy community has given me more opportunities than I can ever imagine. I mean, who am I? I'm fine. I will disclose. I'm 28 years old, new in this area, and people are giving me, just honestly throwing opportunities at me, and it's just me taking advantage of them. So in that case, I was asked to write a symposium review on actually a talk I gave at the American Dairy Science Association annual meeting on how to kind of engage with this undergraduate student population with a focus on female students. And the majority of students in agricultural programs in the United States are female. But as you transition to some of the leadership roles in the dairy industry, you start to have an overwhelming population of males. So there's something lost in translation there. Like, why is that population not necessarily carrying through the whole way up the chain? And, it's me trying to find an answer to a question that there's obviously no clear answer for. But a lot of it is, are we giving these students the support they need throughout their career? Are we throwing opportunities at them, even if they're maybe the more quiet students? Are we supporting their mental health? All of that kind of stuff comes into play. So I guess long story short, it was me deciding I absolutely love mentorship. I love giving these students opportunities, and an opportunity being thrown my way to write a paper about it and to give a presentation on it. So I took that opportunity and wrote a very different style of paper for me, because I'm used to research papers, and this was, I used some statistics in there, but still it was just a very different topic, and it was really cool to write.
Yeah, really great. And a topic that really needs to be addressed. And I know that when I'm a reproduction person, it's getting better now, but you train mostly women. And I think that's one of the things that my friends and family, when I say, no, when I teach introductory dairy science, I'm standing in front of a room full of 180 women and 20 men. And my graduate students are typically women. But then when I go to like a dairy conference, maybe not ADSA, but maybe a sort of a more applied dairy conference, it's all men, so you're right. There's something happens there, and it's a very interesting thing. And we can't, as a dairy, there's so much work to be done in dairy and all aspects of dairy, that we can't let half of our eligible people go a different direction, and so it's just something I think a lot about. And I thought that was really good to have that in there. I know Jess McCart, the new editor-in-chief of JDS Communications, is very interested in these types of topics, and she's really excellent. So I appreciate that very, very much. What I want to do is I want to talk to David for a second, and then I want to go back to you, Grace, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the different elements of this special issue that we have, the different papers we have, and then we'll probably go back to David and talk a little bit about sort of his paper specifically and dig into this concept of the dairy matrix. So, David Everett, first of all, you have to tell me, what is the RIDIT? Well, you've got a lot of explaining to do, David. First of all, you're an Australian living in New Zealand. Okay. That's an
right.
odd. Do they know? They must know you're Australian instantly, correct or not?
Yeah, you can get away with it because the accent's quite similar, but I practice hard.
You practice hard. So I noticed that one of the things that really strikes me. So before you tell me about the RIDIT, one that strikes me about your career as you've moved around to a lot of different places. So your boyhood was spent in Australia, and then I don't know what you do in Australia. What city were you from, or what town were you from, or what province were you from, state or whatever they are down there? Where are you from?
Well, I was born and grew up in a city called Newcastle, and that is in the state of New South Wales. Sydney's the capital of the state.
Sydney.
Hmm.
And then I hope New South Wales, is that the one in the south? I hope it's in the south, right? It's in the south. Please tell me
Um,
that.
yeah, it's kind of in the southeast. Yeah.
Where's Melbourne?
Melbourne is in the state of Victoria. That's a southern state, just south of New South Wales.
Yeah, yeah. And so you're sitting around and you're, I don't know, playing cricket with your friends and probably drinking way too much beer, and you decide you're going to move to Wisconsin. How'd that work?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Well, it was a long journey to get to Wisconsin, but that's where I did my PhD. And not as young as Grace. I think I was 27 when I started my PhD, so that was a while ago.
Yeah.
And well, I'm a chemistry graduate from the University of Sydney, so I'm really interested in physical chemistry and colloids and surfaces.
Hmm.
And that was my master's degree as well. And then I got a job. I said, I don't want to do a PhD right now. So I got a 3-year job at a government research center called CSIRO. And I was in the food division. And they gave me a cheese project. And I've never looked back. So I still work on cheese.
Yeah. So does yeah.
Yeah. I stopped after 3 years and went to Wisconsin after that.
Yeah, so it looks like, just kind of looking at your career, you've had time in academia, but you've also had time in industry as well. What was the long you worked for Nestle for a while? Or no, you never worked for Nestle?
Nope, never worked for them.
Where was your longest time you spent in industry? Where was that? Was or did you ever spend time in industry?
Yeah, 2 years.
That was just 3 years?
Two.
Two.
I worked at a food ingredient company in Melbourne, Australia, and that was straight after my PhD, actually. And I went into academia quickly after that.
Yeah, yeah. And I saw you were at UC Davis for a while. Is that right or no? Or Cal Poly, one or the other?
That's also not right. And
Oh,
doing well
good.
here, Matt.
Well, I already had my degree, so I failed the class, but it's okay. So you worked in California somewhere. I know that.
I did. I
Okay.
did. I had the Leprino Foods professorship at California Polytechnic State University, or Cal Poly, and
Okay.
that's in San Luis Obispo. So I was on faculty there for 3 years, and it does sound like I'm sort of moving around a lot, doesn't it? But
Well,
3 years there.
How could you ever leave Cal Poly? Like, it's on the beach, isn't it, practically, or on the ocean?
Yeah, it is, Matt. But you got to realize that Australia is all about beaches.
Australia, yeah, and the beaches could kill you. Yeah, I know about
Oh,
Australia, your
yeah.
beaches.
Beaches are as common as dairy farms.
It's like New Zealand. So Reddit Institute, that sounds like a pretty nice place to be. It's mainly a research place then.
Yes, it is. It is a center that's hosted by Massey University. So I have a faculty position at Massey as well. And so I supervise PhD students there. And that's pretty much it. I don't do any undergraduate teaching, which is kind of sad because I enjoy doing that.
Yeah.
So the Reddit Institute was set up about, when was it set up? 22 years ago, I think. And it was a partnership of 5 different organizations around New Zealand, 3 universities and 2 Crown Research Institutes, which are basically like the USDA research centers funded by the government. So the Reddit Institute is located on the Massey University campus, and we have some great research activities we engage with our partner organizations. Some of my colleagues work on more commercial projects, and I guess we've got about 100 researchers, I think, spread across New Zealand, and about 100 grad students.
So can you explain for our listeners who may not understand about New Zealand? I think I'm probably pretty close here. 5 million people in New Zealand, 4 million dairy cows in New Zealand. What does milk and milk processing mean to the country of New Zealand?
That's an interesting question. But by the way, there are 5 million people and 5 million cows. So
oh, yeah.
We all have our own personal cow here in New Zealand. It works out very well. It's a big dairying country. And it's green, rolling hills, lots of cows, not so many sheep anymore, lots of vineyards as well. and very much an agricultural economy. So it's kind of a rarity amongst wealthy first world countries that it's mostly agricultural. We have quite a bit of milk in New Zealand. We produce about the same amount as the state of California, which is the largest dairy state in the US. And with 5 million people, we really can't drink all of that milk. We drink about 2% of it. So the other 98% is exported, not as milk, but as shelf stable products like milk powder and cheese and things like that. So it's a big part of the economy. We have a large company here called Fonterra that is probably about 88% of the dairy industry. So I think it's about the fourth or fifth largest dairy company in the world, and a lot of smaller players as well. So lots of opportunity for dairy research in this country.
And you work on cheese. You mentioned you worked on cheese, but I didn't think cheese was a big part of the dairy processing world in New Zealand. I thought it was mostly powder. Not true, or powder,
That's
butter?
true.
That is true. Okay.
That's true. Yep. It's quite a nimble processing industry in New Zealand. So when the market prices go up and down for different products, cheese and skim milk powder and whole milk powder and things like that, and so they can pivot really quickly into making products as it's needed to take advantage of the market conditions.
Yeah.
Cheese it's big, but nowhere near as big as milk powder.
So what do you think of American cheese? You ever eat American cheese?
Yeah, well, I lived in the US for 8 years, so that was any kind of cheese there, pretty much. What cheese too. American cheese, you mean not the processed cheese? You're talking about American cheese in general?
No, I'm talking about the processed cheese, the stuff that milk goes into the plant one day and comes out the next. I mean, that's American cheese. What is in American cheese? How is it different than cheddar cheese, for example? Remember that, I've been thinking a lot about American cheese because my friends always ask me about it. I said, that's not really cheese. It's cheese, right?
It's cheese. It's got added things in it. And as I'm sure most of our listeners will know, that cheese doesn't have a lot in it. It's got milk, it's got culture, it's got rennet, and it's got salt.
Yeah.
Things, right? With processed cheese, you're adding a lot of other stuff. You might be adding a bit of butter oil. You might be adding a bit of powder. You might be, you'd definitely be adding emulsifying salts. And it's all churned up at high temperature and out it comes.
Yeah.
Very shelf-stable product. Not great as a gourmet food, I don't think, but it's good for the food ingredient industry.
Does it? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say I did come from the greatest cheese state in the United States, where I did my grad studies, Wisconsin. Biggest cheese producing state. Fantastic cheese there. They really do it well.
I think a lot about cheese, okay, and not so much American cheese. I don't eat it, but I do think a lot about cheese. And I think one of the things that our listeners need to understand is that if you want a food that, if it's made correctly, it's basically like you said, it's got very few ingredients, milk, and I don't know. It's a short list, and that's what makes milk so fantastic. And Grace, you had 4 different papers. You wrote an introduction, and then David, we're going to talk to David in a second. But then you also invited a paper on infant formula in protein digestion and gut barrier health. Tell me about that paper. Is there anything you think about when you think about milk and the production of infant formula that our listeners should maybe know about, or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think when you talk about like breastfeeding versus infant formula, milk is very complicated. And now you're trying to take something that's so complicated and you're trying to mimic it using a variety of ingredients. And obviously we'll talk a lot about the milk matrix, but when you're trying to mimic it, it's not an easy thing to do. And when you're talking about infant formula, well, now you're working with a population that everybody wants to keep healthy and make sure they're growing up with strong cognitive skills and just having all the right nutrition. So it becomes a really interesting topic to see how we formulate infant formula, but also how processing affects infant formula. What are the components going in? All of that, I think, is necessary to cover in an issue like this.
One of the things that was brought up in this paper was the processing and heating and processing and implications for the quality of the milk that goes into infant formula. So I'm assuming that maybe that has to do with, normal pasteurization of milk is blah blah blah, whatever the number is. You know better than me. But do you when you do infant formula, do you heat it up more? Do you have different processing to make it ultra safe for infants, or is there just something about heating up milk that changes some of the properties of milk or something along those lines?
Yeah, so I'm not specifically an expert in infant formula, but when you talk about, let's just talk about milk powder for a second. So pasteurization, 161 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 seconds, and then you're making a milk powder. So then you send it through an evaporator. And evaporation occurs under vacuum, which reduces the temperature needed to evaporate some of that water. So it ends up being kind of a gentle heating process. And then you go through spray drying, and you might have some other steps in there, but you go through spray drying, and now, well, you're turning a liquid into a powder, which you would think is a really intense process, and it is. You reach some high temperatures there, but with the evaporation that's occurring, and evaporation causes some cooling, it ends up being more gentle than you would realize it is as far as what it does to the product. So you don't get as much degradation of components as you would expect. However, yes, when you're making infant formula, you're more concerned about the existence of potentially spores and stuff like that. So you have to be more considerate with the heat treatment that you're applying. David, do you have anything to add?
Oh, that's a pretty good summary, Grace.
Yeah, okay.
It's interesting, isn't it? There are experts out there making sure our food is safe, sort of unsung heroes that care, like that makes a difference to them that it's safe, and the last paper by a lead author was woman. I see Rafael Jimenez Flores on this as well. The milk fat globule membrane, which we're going to talk about in a second, as a bioactive ingredient. Is this, and maybe David wants to answer this, or is this the major target when we talk about bioactivity, this milk fat globule membrane? Is that the big daddy of the matrix, or is that where would you rank it of all the things in the dairy matrix? Is that, because it sounds like, so I'm looking at this paper 5, summary of the clinical studies of the milk fat globule membrane enriched instant formula. And it's all about positive effects on all sorts of stuff in infants. So is it the big daddy? Is that what we want? Why don't we just isolate that out of milk and feed it to people? Do people do that, Dave?
They certainly do. It's called buttermilk.
What? Buttermilk is lots of milk fat. I thought buttermilk is where you took milk and added like lemon juice to it, and you get buttermilk.
Lemon juice? That might be paneer cheese, maybe, but
that's another thing my mother did and didn't tell me about. Okay, like that's not buttermilk.
Well, buttermilk there's traditional buttermilk, and there's buttermilk that you might find in the supermarket. The common buttermilk is based on skim milk, so it's probably not as enriched in the milk fat globule membrane as traditional buttermilk. So basically what you do when you churn cream to make butter. Okay, so you start out with like 30%, 35% fat in cream. You churn it, cold temperature, you make butter. Butter has a legal minimum of 80% fat in it. So what goes out is a liquid stream. And I'll get technical here with surface chemistry, but it's a phase inversion of the fat globules. You end up with a continuous phase of fat in butter, and the membrane that made the emulsion globules then comes out as a water-soluble component into the buttermilk. So yes, you can do it.
So I want to ask you, Dave, about your paper, and the title of your paper was "The Impact of Dairy Food Matrix on Digestion and Absorption." Okay, so how would you? Okay, and I noticed I read your paper. You have you mentioned structural elements of the dairy food matrix first. And so in this paper, you talk about minerals, casein micelles, fat globules, and the milk fat globule membrane, which we've been talking about. So how do those all come together to make milk? Okay, I look at milk and it's fluid and white. So if I put it on a microscope, I'm going to see something other than just white stuff underneath the microscope, or how does that all work?
Well, if the microscope is powerful enough, you'll see the small particles which scatter light and make it white.
Okay.
So those particles are basically the casein micelle and the fat globules. So they scatter light. And if you want to see the true color of milk, and I've done this in a lab, is you take out the impact of the light scattering, which means removing the fat. It's pretty simple. You just use a separator. Removing the casein micelles, a little bit more difficult, but you can do that. And what you end up with is a clear liquid, which is all of the soluble components of milk. And it's got a kind of a greenish orange color to it. So you
No
could
way.
make the argument that's the true color of milk. That's due to riboflavin, by the way.
Oh my gosh. So the casein myocells, that sounds like where all the protein is. Is that where all the protein is, or is that what is a
That's,
casein micelle?
that's about 80% of the protein in bovine milk. And so that's the caseins, which assemble into a complicated structure. We call it a micelle, but if you're a chemist, it's not really a micelle. It's basically an aggregate of proteins and minerals. And
Mm-hmm.
the other 20% is the whey proteins, which are very important for nutrition. They have the limiting amino acids that we need in our diet.
No way. The whey proteins?
Whey proteins are very nutritious.
What? But I make cheese. I got to get rid of the whey proteins. That's no good.
Well, from a nutritional perspective, maybe not, but from a taste perspective, that's great. I do have one of my colleagues in Canada who is a whey protein expert, always referred to the manufacture of cheese as a byproduct of whey powder manufacture.
A byproduct? Yeah,
I think he's
sure. Right.
joking.
Yeah. Because I thought so. So this is a bit of a digression, Dave. But I thought for many years whey protein was sort of looked at as a little bit of a waste product of milk production, and maybe I'm wrong, but I remember it's something like that.
Yes, it was. It wasn't until I think about the 1960s that processes were developed to dry it into a powder and sell it off. But it's very important for sports drinks and nutritional muscle building drinks. It's got those branched chain amino acids that are quite important for muscle growth.
Leucine and stuff. Yeah. Okay. So the whey proteins are now valuable.
Whey proteins are valuable, and the key to dairy processors is to manufacture these with as high a protein content as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Whey protein, if you just dry whey, it's about 30% protein, the rest of it's mostly lactose. So you could argue it's a sugar drink.
Mm-hmm.
If you remove the lactose, then you can up the protein content
Mm-hmm.
and you go all the way up to something like 93% protein. That's the most
Mm-hmm.
valuable whey powder.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question. I'm going to name a product. Okay. Are you ready? Fairlife milk. Fairlife. And I think they sell something that's high in protein, a milk product that's high in protein. Are they adding back in whey proteins or casein proteins? Or are you not sure what they're adding back in?
Well, I'm not entirely familiar, but I believe it's ultrafiltration of milk. Uh,
Okay.
and what they do is they concentrate that up using a membrane. So it concentrates up the caseins and the whey proteins.
Okay, so both. And so that stuff is, if you've ever tried it, I don't own stock in Fairlife, but it's really nice. It's really nice stuff. Really nice stuff. So I have a question, Dave. You ready? Casein, A2A2 milk, the real deal or not? Do I need to buy A2A2 milk? Look at Grace is like, I want to hear the answer to this one. Okay, so
Yeah,
explain
well,
what A2A2 milk is, okay?
right. So A2 milk has a beta casein in A2 milk has an amino acid variation, and it's a peptide of 7 amino acids, and it's called caseinomorphin, beta caseinomorphin 7 amino acids, and it's different in A2 milk. And the argument being made is that if you go back millennia into the dairy herds, that was the predominant kind of milk that people consumed. But due to breeding, now we have preponderance of A1 milk in our dairy cows. And so people thought, well, aren't people getting kind of sicker over in more modern times? Maybe milk's got something to do with it. This is not cause and effect. This is just correlations. A lot of the work that came about 25 years ago, actually came out of New Zealand, was that this A2 milk is great for limiting diseases such as lung cancer, autism, schizophrenia, things like that. Now, I used to give that paper to my students, and I'd ask them to pull it apart and tell me what's wrong with that. And a lot of those correlations really have no mechanisms behind them whatsoever. So, and then people were saying, well, maybe there's other things that A2 milk can do. So they've toned it down a lot over the last 25 years, and now they say that it aids in gut comfort, which is a much more vague thing to talk about and provide evidence for. But That's about as far as they go now with their marketing.
Yeah, so I thought it was interesting. Like you kind of broke down these elements in milk in your paper, and you talked about two things: digestibility and how milk is digested. And you also talked about how milk and these elements are absorbed. And I had no idea. And you mentioned that kind of what happens in the stomach in terms of digestion is a little different than what happens in your intestine in terms of digestion. And can you explain, like, and maybe it's, and I think there's also elements of whether I'm eating cheese or drinking milk. And one of the things I sort of thought was interesting is you mentioned that I don't know if it was cheese or milk digestion, but there's a clot formed and that slows down the exit of the milk. And can you just explain digestion in the stomach of a dairy product versus digestion in the intestine of a dairy product? And because I think you spent some time talking about that.
Yeah, so the stomach is an acidic environment, right? So we often talk about digestion as being multiple phases. So you've got, and some people might disagree, but you do have digestion in the mouth. That you might have amylase that breaks down carbohydrates and things like that. When it goes down into the stomach, further down, you've got a low pH environment. So the stomach produces acid. It recognizes there's food coming its way. It needs to have acid to start breaking down the structures. And depending upon the kind of food, if you look at cheese, for example, you get breakdown of lipids structures, which would be in cheese. You get breakdown of protein aggregates, and a lot of the absorption takes place as it goes through into the lower part of the gut, which is the small intestines. So it goes through a little opening called the pylorus from the stomach into the duodenum just below the stomach. And that's when all of the further breakdown occurs of the protein and you get absorption. But if you ate a piece of cheese, that's not going to be absorbed through your what's called the epithelium in your lower intestine, because it's just a big chunk of cheese, right? It's got to be broken down into smaller components. So that's where the complexity comes into play. And for lipid structures, which I'm particularly interested in, and of course that's an integral part of cheese, you get a process called micellization. Now, these are different to the casein micelles I talked about before. So the micellization is where the bile salts sort of get injected into the digester, and bile salts are very good detergents, and they break apart fat structures. So then you get the creation of, instead of these lipid structures, which are probably, they start out several micrometers in size in a fat globule, they go down into hundreds of nanometers. That's still too big to be absorbed. So that's what the bile salts do. They break down those structures and create these really tiny lipid structures that can then be absorbed. Now, I had a PhD student recently who did a project on that, and he used synchrotron X-ray scattering to figure out the size of these micelles. And I can tell you that they're 1.4 to 1.8 nanometers in size. So you're approaching molecular size there.
And how do you, so one of the things that you mentioned in your article was sort of this idea that you can't look at milk in isolation. What did you mean by that? Or can you just describe what you meant by that? So, for example, how did milk get in butter? How did butter get a bad nutritional rap? Where did that come from? Okay, too much saturated fat or something in butter. I don't remember. How did that, where did the science come from?
Well, I can tell you some interesting stories about butter. And maybe I'll just start out with this, that when the margarine industry was being developed, and margarine was a shockingly bad product in the 1700s. It was basically ground up intestines and beef tallow and things like that. It was poor people's butter, basically. And so there was a lot of pushback from the dairy industry, which is a powerful lobby. And so they managed to push through a lot of regulations in various parts of the world to prevent people from eating margarine, and they wanted people to eat butter. So my favorite one is in the 60s, I understand that margarine be colored pink to prevent people or turn consumers off from buying it. Great idea. In a lot of parts of the US, there was rules against dyeing margarine into a yellow color. So if you don't color margarine, it's kind of a pearly color. So there was a pushback by the dairy lobbyists about coloring margarine because it looked too much like butter. Now, margarine had a problem with trans fatty acids early on. Now they've solved that problem, so it's not enriched in trans fatty acids anymore. So it is healthy. But back then in the 70s, it wasn't so healthy.
Mm. Mm.
So I have a wonderful picture I like to show my students. It is a picture of a child eating butter, and the caption is, "Butter is slippery. It's good for you because it lubricates your arteries."
Right. Yeah, we
It's
wish,
a joke
right?
picture, of course.
Yeah, yeah.
But butter has saturated fats. There is now the thinking now, the consensus is that saturated fats aren't necessarily bad. So that's great for the butter industry, and butter is increasing in sales, which is yeah, I think it's got a lot of other health components in butter besides the saturated fat issue,
Hmm.
add to its nutritional and health benefits. So yeah, with butter, it now I've forgotten your original question. Sorry, man, I went off on a tangent there.
Well, because somehow we like butter and whole milk was given a bad reputation. I think even just because of the fat, but then all of a sudden people said, well, that fat's not so bad for you. And I was just kind of, well, how did we go from fat being bad for you to fat not being bad for you? I mean, I just don't understand that switch.
Fat is in milk and dairy products. The issue, the big issue is cholesterol,
Mm.
which is a fat, right?
Hmm.
So the cholesterol, if and the thinking was that milk's got cholesterol. If you drink milk, you'll get cholesterol in your arteries, right? So it's not as
Hmm.
simple as that. So this is where the dairy matrix comes in. So if I give you a teaspoon of cholesterol, and then I give you a piece of cheese that has the exact same amount of cholesterol, which is better for you? Now, it's a pretty easy question. Of course, the answer to all of my questions in my lectures is cheese. The cheese is going to be better for you, even though it's got the same amount of cholesterol. And there's a ton of clinical data out there that shows a small yet significant decrease in cardiovascular disease for people who eat cheese, which is really interesting. So I'm not a clinician, but when I look at those studies, and that was the rationale for setting up that PhD project looking at cholesterol a few years back. So I'm interested in putting some mechanisms onto those clinical studies. So what happens is that cholesterol binds to another compound called sphingomyelin in the milk fat globule membrane. And it minimizes or slows down the absorption of cholesterol into your system, circulatory system. So you end up with a higher amount of the high density lipoprotein cholesterol, which is great, and lower amounts of the total cholesterol and the low density lipoprotein cholesterol, which is exactly what you want. So nature has designed milk to be the perfect food for the neonates, the babies. I would argue that it's still a perfect food for those of us that get older. It has
Mm.
lots of health benefits to it. So that's my argument is that we have to look at the food as a whole food, not in isolation.
Mm.
So if you look at food in isolation, and that is the history of nutrition, thankfully not so much in more recent times, but looking at the nutritional value of food ingredients in isolation, but nobody eats food ingredients in isolation. We eat it as whole foods, and that has a profound effect on digestibility and the uptake of nutrients.
Your comments on the cholesterol, which were really important, and remind me of comments by one of our previous guests, Connie Weaver, and we were talking about calcium, and we all understand that calcium milk is a very important source of calcium. And she said, you take a calcium supplement, that's okay. That's not the same as getting your calcium through a dairy product. I mean, I think that was her comment. It's not the same thing. And I think that's really, for our listeners, I think this is really important for us as people to understand is we need to get beyond this era of, kind of reductionist and, let's compare a teaspoon of cholesterol with the cholesterol in cheese and call it good, because that doesn't work anymore. That's not modern science. That's not the way things are. We don't, people didn't evolve eating teaspoons of cholesterol, and people didn't evolve taking calcium supplements. There are probably some things that you can argue it is reasonable. Like, we always add vitamin D to milk. I don't know if they do that in New Zealand, but in America we do. You don't add it in milk in New Zealand, maybe.
Uh,
And I explained to the students in my class that that's kind of tradition, and I explained to them why and where that all came from. But so perhaps there are things that can be taken in isolation, but it shouldn't be viewed as carte blanche. Everything can be taken in isolation. So. Hey, Grace, I wanted to ask you a couple of more questions, and maybe because I've been talking to David for a long time. But Grace, I want to ask you about your thoughts about just where we are in terms of dairy as a food, in terms of health recommendations and ways in which you could see improving the consumption of dairy products, globally. So can you just tell me, I can't remember the last government revision of the food thing, and maybe I don't know if you studied the food pyramid, or do we still have a food pyramid, or how does that all working? Okay, because I remember they revised it, and I don't think dairy took a hit, but can you just explain where we are with the federal government and the recommendations for dairy products?
I always review the food pyramid right before joining any meeting, so I'm very it's now my plate, and I believe it's 2 to 3 cups of dairy per day, and as we mentioned, what was the percentage? 88% of people don't consume that much. However, I have liked the trends I'm seeing. You see it on social media as well as in actual data where the consumption of various dairy products is increasing. But I think there's still room for improvement, and I think the majority of the improvement should come through education and the dairy industry talking about their products more to at a consumer level so they understand the benefits of milk. So I think I'm working on a project about lactose-free ice cream. And we've seen that lactose-free, it's not like a chemical treatment, it's a very physical process. You add an enzyme in that breaks down the lactose. It's still dairy, still great for you. But consumers who are not lactose intolerant actually value lactose. They want lactose in their milk because they think, potentially, this is my assumption, I guess, they think that there's something wrong with lactose-free milk, or there's something vastly different about lactose-free milk, and that's just not true. So I think it's education. Why is milk protein better for you than maybe some plant-based alternatives? And again, I think they're complementary products. I'm not trying to dish on plant-based products, but why is dairy protein a superior source of protein? Why is milk fat superior to some other fat sources? Why hasn't it been associated with cardiovascular related diseases? Just trying to get the education out there to consumers at a level that people can understand, I think that would really help. And of course, the dairy industry is super regulated. I encourage pasteurization and all of that. We have a certain temperature we have to heat it to for a certain time, but most of the processes that dairy foods go under are very physical processes. There's nothing chemical about it. A lot of consumers now are worried about ultra-processed food, and in my opinion, dairy is not typically ultra-processed, and I think that's something else that we can talk more about. Well, you add these stabilizers into some products. Okay, why are we adding those in? Maybe there's some products that we find processing methods instead. But I think there's a lot of room for us to be more transparent about the ingredients that go in, the nutritional benefits of dairy. You mentioned calcium and how it's better absorbed when it's consumed in the format of dairy. Well, why is that? Well, it has the perfect ratio between phosphorus and calcium that allow for this superior absorption, as well as some other things. So why is the matrix really the best way to get some of these components? And I think it is just experts like us talking more about it.
Yeah, and when I teach dairy science to freshmen, I like to bring in, they're so stunned. I bring in a carton of milk. I bring in cottage cheese. I bring in sour cream. I bring in just regular cheese, and I read the labels. There's not a lot in there.
No.
There's not a lot in there. I mean, it's fairly simple, and I think they're surprised by that. And they are sort of interested in, and I think that's what's great about dairy is it's really good for you.
So my favorite thing to do is when I'm at the gym is to share dairy facts, which is probably why I'm not invited to too many parties and my friends are limited. But one that surprised me is I asked them, what's the percent protein in milk? And nobody knew, but we got to about 3.5% after I told them, okay, what's the percent protein in a protein isolate? And nobody knew, but we got to that 90%. And I said, okay, how do you go from fluid milk to a protein isolate? And the first answer was chemicals.
Oh my, yeah.
And it's just, we need to do better. And this person's a very intelligent person, but people don't know, consumers don't know how we get to a certain product and what's happening there. So I think it is an education point.
It is an education, but even for me, how do you get to skim milk. And like, what do you guys put it in some giant centrifuge or something? I mean, how big is that centrifuge? I mean, how in the world do you build a centrifuge big enough to make thousands of gallons of skim milk?
Well, it's a continuous. I could answer that. Do you actually want an answer to this?
So
It's a
it's always
continuous centrifuge, if you will, where it is, yeah, it's spinning really fast and you're separating out the fat, the cream components, higher fat from the skim based on their density differences, because fat is lower density, so it separates out. And yeah, it's a continuous system. So it's flowing through, it's going through a variety of layers of discs, and it's separating out. I could show you a separator. It's really not that big.
No. I mean, I just love walking through dairy processing plants because they smell really good. I don't know. There's kind of this smell they have. I really love it. And then they have all this shiny equipment, and big water cannons to clean stuff up, and it's kind of a cool environment. And I used to live in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina, and I had this running route, and it was through downtown North Carolina, Raleigh. And there was a certain section I would run through. I was like, God, that smells like a milk processing plant. God, that smells like a milk processing plant. And then I finally looked, and it was a milk processing plant. Okay. So they have a unique smell to them. Did you know that? No. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, they're very clean environments. They have a lot, yeah.
So yeah, there's one in downtown Raleigh. It's probably gone now, but anyways, the last question before we close is, and I know there's a movement in the United States to get more fat into the milk in school lunch programs, either whole milk or 2%, and do away with the skim milk in school lunch programs. And let me tell you my experience with my freshmen. I asked them this same question, Grace, to my freshmen. What do you think is skim milk in school lunch programs? And I couldn't believe it. They looked at me and they said, Dr. Lucy, we never drank that milk. Do you think it'll help to change the milk in the school lunch programs? Does that make sense to you as a dairy scientist, to make it either 2% or whole? Does that make sense?
I think so. We mentioned the issue with 88% of people don't consume the recommended servings of dairy. Well, now and again, dairy is super saturated in calcium, right? Well, now you're talking about adolescents who need this calcium more than any other group. So I think it's super important. And then you want a product that is palatable, right? And I actually grew up drinking skim milk. Now I switched to 1%. People always ask me that, like, what percent fat milk do you drink? And I drink 1%, but I also have the Fairlife product. Like, I like milk with some fat in it, and I think a lot of kids do too. It has a different flavor profile, and the milk fat is good for you in the end. So I think making a more palatable product for this age group is important to increase the consumption in such a necessary time period. And I'm sure David has some things to add to that as well.
Yes, of course, the lower fat content milk has less of the milk fat globule membrane in it, which has a lot of those bioactives that are very important for health. So I would totally agree with that. I think that there's no issue with full fat milk as far as I'm concerned. It's healthy. We need to get more people drinking milk or eating dairy products. As I mentioned before, we produce 50 times the amount of dairy products in New Zealand that we can possibly consume. And yet, New Zealand is slightly deficient in calcium in our diet.
Incredible.
Speaks volumes.
Yeah. I'm not sure about New Zealand, but I know in America, per capita consumption increases annually, per capita and consumption. And again, the whole milk, the decline in whole milk consumption is leveled off according to last year's statistics. And so I think we're moving in the right direction. And I think we have a great story to tell. I mean, that's what's nice. I even, if you look at all not necessarily that I believe all human nutritional epidemiological studies, but, there's lots of human nutritional epidemiological studies and some, I'm not going to mention any foods, but some foods come up as bad guys. Okay. Cardiovascular health and cancer, some foods. But the good news about dairy is I always read those studies, and dairy never comes up as a bad guy. It just doesn't show up. Dairy consumption doesn't show up as a bad guy in these huge epidemiological studies. And I think that's the word, it's because it's very natural and it's not processed, and it's really a great food. Grace, I'll ask you a question. I'll ask David a question, and then I'm going to let you go, okay? Because you guys have been great. It's been about an hour. David's got to get to the golf course or whatever he does on Saturday morning or whatever you do.
That'd be a croquet field, actually. Croquet lawn.
So yes. So Grace, so you're a young person. I'll give you two questions here. You ready? So why, Grace? Why dairy science? You walked into I mean, what? Was it a favorite teacher that you said, wow, I just want to do dairy foods? Why? Why not engineering or something?
Yeah, so I mean, my advisor was wonderful, but it's really because dairy is so cool. And it's taking this fluid product that first we've mentioned, it's this white liquid, right? You look at it with a very expensive microscope and you see all these other things and the complexities and over 400 unique fatty acids and all of this complexity. And then you take that and you turn that into cheese and you turn that into butter and you turn that into, whatever. And it's incredible to me, which sounds like I'm the biggest nerd ever when it comes to, and I know a couple people want me to mention milk foams. I love milk foams.
Mm-hmm.
So cool. So in the morning, I like froth my coffee to death just to experience the milk foams because what supports those foams? Well, you're talking about proteins and you're talking about, if you look at them with a microscope, the caseins and the whey proteins absorbing to the surface of these bubbles to stabilize them. And that's just wild, so cool to me. And you're talking about then whipped cream, and that's a totally different structure. And it's just, I don't know, it's so very cool. And by the way, whipped cream is my favorite food. People ask me that all the time too.
I think it's interesting, Grace. You demonstrate, I've said it before in the podcast, but when a scientist, a person like yourself, finds out what you really love and what really excites you and what really interests you, it's so much easier to go to work every day. When you go to work and you're working on stuff that you really enjoy. And I tell people, you spend way too much time at work to go to work and hate it. I mean, it's wonderful when you find that, and I think we all have different stories about how we found those things. So you're 3 years into your faculty position. What's one thing that you're like, didn't expect as a new faculty member? One thing you didn't expect?
I would say how many people reached out to me immediately to collaborate, and specifically people from the dairy industry. And I said that it sounds like the right answer too, but I'm honestly saying it. I still get confused for a student all the time. In fact, earlier today, somebody asked what I was studying for my bachelor's degree, right? I look pretty young. And the dairy industry has just, again, thrown these opportunities at me, and people want to write research grants, and they want to have me present at various conferences, and they're putting me in front of people who will see me present and who will then get me involved in other opportunities. And it's really just been incredible, and I didn't expect it.
I'm going to ask David a question. David, so you were a chemical engineer. What would you be doing if you weren't in dairy? I mean, what other careers that you had an interest in or thought about or wish you'd pursued other than a dairy scientist? Or was there something else out there for you?
Well, physical chemist. I wouldn't call myself an engineer. So we don't have that many steam trains left, so no need for engineers.
That's excellent. So you were a physical chemist, yeah.
Physical chemist, colloid and surface chemistry. I would not change it. I am really, really happy with working in the dairy sector. Bit of industry work, a lot of academic work, a lot of research work. I think that the dairy people are just got to be the nicest people on the planet. and I very much enjoy being part of the American Dairy Science Association as well, because the people are so great to work with and just be with.
Yeah, so I forgot to mention that David is president-elect of the American Dairy Science Association, and that'll be a big task going forward. But we do appreciate your service. Yeah, I agree that for all you young people out there thinking about it, dairy foods is a great career, lots of great jobs, lots of places to fit in, lots of good work to be done. You go to work every day knowing that you're providing a healthy and nutritious product to people, and that is so nice. There can be no higher calling than to provide healthy, nutritious food to the world, and I think that's fantastic. You two guys have been great. I knew you would be great. I didn't really know either of you up until this point, but now I know a little bit about you. And is there anything else you guys like to say before we close to get the message out to the masses, or are we good? David, anything else you'd like to say?
Drink more milk.
And Grace, anything else you'd like to say?
That just about covers it.
Yeah. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to David Everett and Grace Lewis for their time with me today. This has been an awesome conversation, and I'm going to bring this show to the end. If you enjoy Dairy Digressions, be sure to like and subscribe and rate us and spread the word to a friend or colleague. If you have feedback for us, please let us know at adsa.org. For show notes and more episodes of Dairy Digressions and learn everything about the American Dairy Science Association, go to adsa.org. Until next time, thank you to Grace and David, and thank you to everybody for listening. Thank you.
Good night.